Hello everybody, I'm lucky to be speaking to you today from the beautiful lands of the Darkinjung people on the central coast of New South Wales. I recognise their continued connection to the land and waters of this very special place and acknowledge that they never ceded sovereignty, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend this respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening to our session today. Hello, I'm welcome to the fourth episode of the Brisbane Writers Festival Author-Illustrator series, which is a series of discussions with those fabulous, fascinating creatures, the author-illustrators, who can spin magic with both words and images. We're talking to them about their work, their creative processes and what inspires them. So make sure you catch up with previous episodes, which are all available online through the Brisbane Writers Festival website. And I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking today with the incredible Kathleen Jennings, who is an illustrator and writer based in Brisbane. Kathleen's illustrated for publishers such as Tor.com, Little Brown, Simon & Schuster, Small Beer Press, a long list, and for authors who you may recognise, Angela Slatter, Kelly Link, Holly Black, Cassandra Clare and Garth Nix. A very fun career trajectory there. And as a writer, Kathleen is the author of a number of short stories and short comics, and her debut Australian Gothic novella, Flyaway, was published in 2020 by Tor.com and is an incredible read. And a debut poetry collection, Travelogues, as well, published by Brainjar Press in 2020. Flyaway won a British Fantasy Award, a Ditmar, was shortlisted for the World Fantasy Awards, the Curiamel People's Choice Book of the Year Award, the Crawford Award, and the Australian Shadows Award. It's a long, long list. And your short fiction, Kathleen, that's won several Ditmar Awards and been shortlisted for the U.G. Foster Memorial Award and several Aurealis Awards. I believe you've also completed a Master of Philosophy in Creative Writing, which I have been cyber stalking you. Am I right in thinking you did it on the visual evocation of the beautiful sublime in Australian Gothic literature?
I did, that is correct.
Which just sounds, it's an enchanting title in itself. And at the moment you're embarked on a PhD in creative writing.
Yes, I am here at the University of Queensland. I should say, speaking from the country of the Agra and Turrbal people as well, and same acknowledgements. But yes, I'm doing my PhD up here on novel methods of creative observation.
Wonderful. And do you also find time to eat, sleep and breathe?
I do, but I accomplish everything by procrastinating on everything else.
Oh, brilliant. We should start a support group. It's astonishing how many high achievers are just superb procrastinators among all their other talents, I think.
I think the trick is to find ways to cut off the more tempting procrastination so that you just have creative things to switch between.
Creative procrastination, yeah, that's a very good, also, yeah, pro tip right out of the gate there. I think it's a good life hack. You know, make your procrastination constructive and you never need to feel guilty again. Yeah, I don't think you, I mean, you obviously are a master at creative procrastination because your body of work is pretty staggering. Like you work across a range of genres, don't you? And you're incredibly eclectic and versatile in the sorts of age ranges and sort of, I mean, you work across spec fic, fantasy, adult fantasy, YA, middle grade, and you have balanced, you know, creating your own work with illustrating other people's work, which is a whole different sort of approach to sort of creating narratives and things. How do you actually define yourself, or do you like to defy definition? Like, would you define yourself as a particular type of author, or?
Well, probably how I define myself depends a little bit on the company in which I find myself. For example, if I'm hanging out with illustrators, I'll often say I'm an author. And if I'm hanging out with my favorite authors, I'll be like, hi, I'm an illustrator. So author-illustrator or illustrator-author, really, I think I've been a little better known as an illustrator than as a writer, although I've never stopped writing. And I always thought initially I would become a writer, and then suddenly I ended up being an illustrator, which is great. You get to spend a lot more time in a lot more books. When you're a writer, you only get to spend time on your own, really. So as far as the type of illustration, I really just tend to say a book illustrator, although I do more than that. But my first love really comes from that mid-century and also golden age children's book illustration, Pauline Bain's Narnia and Farmer Giles of Ham by Tolkien. Those illustrations were really formative for me. And so all the style I've worked in is always drawn from that. And for some reason, I mean, I know why it was, but for some reason ended up illustrating the literary adult end of science fiction. And it's only recently that I've been drifting more into actually illustrating a little bit more middle grade and YA, which is what people always assumed I did. But at the same time, I've been working on a memoir for an urban ecologist, Daryl Jones, coming out later this year. It's great, which has been a joy as well, trying to bring some of those sensibilities to something that's not technically my genre, but is definitely overlaps all my fascinations.
It's interesting that you mentioned Farmer Giles of Ham and those books that was sort of, formative when you were growing up, because I've noticed that in talking to people who are creative, there seems to be a bit of a commonality in that they all, well, not all, obviously, but there seems to be a recurring theme of the kind of childhood that actually gave you the chance to immerse yourself in that kind of experience, and this kind of, childhoods that occupy a sort of a liminal space where you have a chance to sort of connect with the natural world and the world of your own imagination, and time to develop your ideas, and time to get bored perhaps and do that creative procrastination that you were talking about. And it sounds to me that you had a childhood a little bit like that, because you actually grew up on a fairly remote cattle farm, didn't you? And had all your education through School of the Air. So do you want to talk a little bit about the role that creativity played in your childhood as you were kind of becoming you?
Sure. So I grew up mostly in Western Queensland. We did have a few periods of time in which we moved back to Brisbane, but on a cattle property, which my parents bought because they thought it seemed like a good idea. My father grew up in Sydney and was an army officer. My mother was from America, from an Air Force family nursing background.
Wow, so they're not scared to take an abrupt right turn and try something.
In retrospect. So there are some very amusing stories about how all that started and happened. But from the perspective of growing up in that area, we didn't really get any television reception anyway. And then my father acquired a dislike of television and chopped down the aerial to build a pig crate at one point. So every night after dinner, my mother would read to all of us. It began with my father reading to us, and that was fine while he was reading fairy tales. And then he got really sick one night of reading Little Red Riding Hood. He said, I've read it 76 times and I can't read it again. And so he got down one of Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House in the Big Woods, first book of that series, and started reading it while my mother was doing the dishes. And she said, you're not putting enough emotion into it. You're not doing the voices. So she took over the reading and he did the dishes. And it was that way really until I left for boarding school in year 11. Every night my mother would read to all of us. And so it was just very much a time immersed in books, but also living on a farm, growing up, running a little bit wild, at least between the trees, all that hands-on experience of the world. And then when we weren't being read to, reading to ourselves, reading to each other, reading to friends who visited and couldn't get away quickly enough because we lived so far from anywhere, drawing constantly. I don't think I thought as consciously that I would be an illustrator. I always liked drawing and never stopped, but I wanted to work with stories. And the obvious way to do that seemed to be a writer. But I do remember recognizing Pauline Baines as an illustrator, as a person who contributed to a world that I loved in the Chronicles of Narnia. I remember recognizing that very early and being fascinated by the images in the pictures, in the books, and trying very hard to recreate that effect through my writing, which then eventually became creating an effect through my illustration, which now means that when I write, I try to write in the styles that I don't illustrate, and try to write in a painterly style, or write to evoke a particular aesthetic that perhaps I can't achieve on paper in other ways.
That was actually something I wanted to talk to you about, because I love the interplay between, you know, you seem to have access to a number of different languages in both your writing and your illustrating, and like you say, you've got your illustration is very narrative, and it, you know, tells a clear story. Even if it's a single illustration, you kind of convey that sense of sort of, you know, place and time and action and character, and evoke a particular sort of narrative mood in it. And your writing is very painterly. You've got a lot of really visual imagery and a lot of sort of sensory, you know, sort of sensory texture in it. So and I think you've said before that, you know, the written line and the drawn line, you kind of have to feel your way into both of them and get the right line for the mood and things that you're trying to create. So I'd be really interested to hear a little bit more about the cross-pollination between the two. So like in the process of shaping your books, particularly the ones that you both write and illustrate, is it sort of a pas de deux dance between the two of them? Like, how do you know when the illustrations should carry something and when it's the narrative's turn? And, you know, are there particular aspects of the story that you know, you'll give to the narrative, and aspects that you'll try and capture with the illustrations? How do they?
Lots of good questions.
Probably quite a big question.
It sort of depends where I start from, because if I start trying to do a project, a little story or something that's predominant, that's going to have illustrations in it, I find I tend to start stripping the words back and ending up with just illustrations sometimes. Whereas when I'm writing, unless I'm holding the illustrations in mind the whole time, it's very easy, and I found this writing Flyaway, it's very easy to end up putting all of that work and commentary that illustrations would provide directly into the text. So if I'm illustrating someone else's story, I'm looking for things I can pick up and run with. I'm looking for moments of motion I can capture. I'm looking for the little hints and background stories that are happening that I can bring a bit more to the foreground. When I wrote, well, it's published as a novella in America and a novel in Australia, but they're the same length. When I wrote Flyaway, I'd always planned to do illustrations for it. That was part of that idea, because I did it together with my MPhil, of evoking a particular visual effect. I got to the end and realized that all the work I'd usually put in an illustration on someone else's work, I'd already done in the prose for this. So going through and actually having to make that conscious decision with the illustrations. I'm just looking for one here.
Ah, lovely. So
you're trying to capture more a style or a mood, to ornament it in a way that said, this is a story that felt like it was worthy of pictures, and it's got silhouettes because it ties into the Gothic and the fairy tale. Whereas the descriptions in the book, which are quite occasionally deliberately painterly, some of that was, I was setting out to try and capture an image of the beauty of the landscape as I remember it. It is a Gothic novel, terrible things happen in that landscape. But so much Australian Gothic literature, this isn't wrong, but it's just so much of it is the dead red heart and dust blowing across the plain. And that was not my experience of the landscape. So I was trying to capture my memory of it, but also occasionally to go, I want this to feel like a Tom Roberts painting, and go and look at The Breakaway, for example, and essentially do an exercise, which I set for students occasionally when I do guest lectures, of working out all the adjectives and phrases and terms and colors and textures in that painting, and working out how to put them into words, and then how to use that vocabulary, like deliberately lift a vocabulary from a painting, which I couldn't refer to in the text because the character wouldn't be familiar with it. So that was a fascinating exercise. With other projects, with other people's work, it is much more of that. Am I going to be ornamental, or is it going to be movement? I like movement because I like detail, but not necessarily straight lines. I tell people I will draw a spaceship for you, but it's going to be Art Nouveau. There's no straight lines. So just making that balance, but it is quite conscious. I was going to show you again really quickly. It's not a spoiler because even I can barely tell what this is. These 2 pages of my notebook, which are actually notes for a written piece, trying to set a color tone for a story, and then trying to capture some of the visual images that I want to make sure are in there in the written form.
That's fascinating. So before you've even really formed the narrative, or before you've embarked on actually writing, you're actually beginning from a point of, you know, colour and just that sort of visual sense and feeling your way into the words through the images.
There's one story I wrote, The Heart of Alabaster, which is very much, I wanted to write a steampunk story that didn't feel sepia toned. I wanted it to feel blue and breezy. So that was part of it. There's also, again, you might not be able to see these, but it's just to show you the tiny little drawings here, which are doing an exercise I quite enjoy doing for art or writing, where you pick an image, often a cover image, like girls running from houses, classic Gothic image, and go, how exactly am I defining the Gothic? Like, what is the feeling I'm going for in this picture? What if I roll it slightly into a related field? What if I roll this image of a girl running from a house and make it more fairy tale? Okay, add a sense of enchantment. What if I wanted to make it more horror? Okay, there definitely has to be something that's going to get her. Okay, that means that the Gothic has to be a chance something bad could get her, but you're not necessarily sure it's bad or that it will get her. Roll it into folk horror, roll it into the weird. It's a lovely little visual exercise. Any illustrators or people who like art listening, it's a lovely exercise to try and do that. Take a cover image, take an iconic picture, work out some other genres, make it a children's story, and just roll it back and forth, make it a theatre set, and see both how the picture changes and how you define the edges of the effect that you're going for.
And you actually have a fantastic blog with a whole lot of resources for those sorts of creative exercises, don't you? Observation journal prompts and snapshots and, you know, breakdowns of your creative process in a lot of detail, and different approaches to story building, like you just described there, like jumping off points and ways of slamming different ideas together and seeing what sticks. And it's a really lovely, generous resource for anyone who, you know, wants to kind of have a bit of a masterclass in how to kind of kickstart creativity, I think. So yeah, strongly encouraged.
Or how to procrastinate if you want.
Procrastinate creative. Well, like you said, if it's creative enough, it sort of transforms, doesn't it? We don't have to feel guilty. But
I was just going to say, it's been really fun keeping that observation journal, and I have written a fair bit about it. I'm starting to do workshops and recently changed my PhD topic, so it's now on that, which I have been doing for the whole length of my PhD rather than the original topic, which I was working on, but not to the same extent. But a lot of that is trying to find a way to think through what I'm doing on the page, written or drawn, and pursue things I'm fascinated in. I found a lot of creative journaling approaches were a little bit too useful, but a bit too confined for me, or directed me in the course of someone else's interest or fascinations. And this is a way to play with that, to roll things out on the page. And most of the activities I put on there, I try to do in a way that they could be either for an illustrator or a writer. And
that's what I loved looking through it. Like, there are obviously ideas that you've kind of quietly sat with and worked through in your own little creative space in isolation, but have found them really useful. And then, you know, it's really generous of you to put them out there in a form that everyone can use. And yeah, strongly encourage everyone to check out your blog. In fact, I think I might be going back and playing with some of those ideas myself when I'm busy procrastinating. But that's one thing I've really noticed about both your writing and your illustration is that you seem to have an incredibly eclectic mind. You seem to have this really eclectic, omnivorous sort of intellect and you've kind of engaged with a wide range of experiences and sort of points of inspiration, I guess, across your life. And quite an interesting sort of multifaceted background, which I think goes along with that. There seems to be a kind of a theme emerging where you love to kind of slam unexpected ideas together and see what sort of weird alchemical reaction occurs when you bring these two sort of, you know, maybe diametrically opposed elements together. And I sort of feel a little bit like that about your life, really, because you, as well as your creative writing qualifications. You've got a law degree as well, haven't you? And you've worked in property law, am I correct? And
property law and contracts for the Department of Transport as well.
right, yeah. So you work for the Department of Transport and Main Roads.
Yes, in Queensland.
And you teach at the University of Queensland.
Yeah, so class tutor for a few subjects on and off.
And you've travelled widely as well, haven't you? And
I have. I think it's interesting hearing you say this. My immediate response is to go, no, it's not that adventurous, because I'm a very safe person. I don't do I don't do extreme sports or adventure tourism or anything. I think I like to at least touch things. I like to at least see things. I want to have a look at everything. And the reason I ended up doing law and becoming, well, I did law to make my arts degree, which was not in art, it was in English literature and German. The reason I did my law degree was to make that look impressive, and then I accidentally became a lawyer because I got an offer before.
Is it when you accidentally become a lawyer?
Well, it's difficult to get out of it, I have to say. I remember my father saying the door in is always narrower than the door out, which is not completely true. It is something that I've tended to do. I'm like, well, I don't want to not have done this. I don't want to be the person who says no to doing something, but at the same time, I'm not incredibly hands-on in a lot of areas of life. Like my friends who are my big board gaming friends are like, come over for board games, and like, invite enough people that you can play without me, because I would like to sit and watch everyone play the board game, but I don't want to participate personally. You don't want me to participate because I can become extremely competitive because I was a lawyer and I get banned from categories.
You turn into a monster, do you? A category monster.
But I think it's just that fascinating. My parents were very interested in everything, and that definitely came across. And just that sense of, at least if you never know when it will be useful. You never know what things you'll learn and just be able to use to solve another problem, to knock together, to bring together.
Yeah, so you kind of seem to be a real observer and a collector of really diverse experiences and ideas, and kind of engage quite deeply with that. Sort of a very, to create, like, you've obviously got quite a fertile mind, and I think that comes across in your writing, and the sorts of elements that you work together, because you've obviously got this very fairy tale, folkloric, sort of allegorical element, and with fable and whimsy and that kind of thing. But then it's very firmly grounded in place as well, in the real world, like you were talking about. Obviously you did your dissertation on the Australian landscape and literature, but so you've got that juxtaposition of the fantastic and the really mundane and the really concrete. I noticed in Flyaway, like even just in the first sentences of Flyaway, you have that kind of, you get that sense of the sort of huge presence of the primordial Australian landscape, and then the little sort of mundane structures of human civilization sort of scattered on top, almost, the petrol station and the war memorial and the street names and the little suburbs and things. And then you've sort of overlaid all of that with the sort of, I think you call it the smooth engineering of the mining industry that's kind of churned all that up, and both the landscape and the human settlements and things, and then all of that is the stage that you use to kind of unfold this really sort of magical fairy tale story. So I think it's really interesting that you've got you've got this kind of sort of that drive to collect elements and then combine them. How important is it for you to kind of, you've obviously got that that sort of what's the word I'm looking for? It's that kind of, that sort of really, not primordial, but that sort of air storytelling, like those sort of foundation myths that culture,
sort of archetypes almost.
Yeah, archetypal sort of so you've got those sort of mythic archetypes, and then how important is it to you to take those and ground them in the real world? Like, what do you get from the interplay of those two sort of levels of reality?
I think they go, it's on a couple levels. So I love that ability to use a story as a template for other things, to put bits into other images, to put bits into stories. I love fairy tales and myths and all those, and legends and all of that. I do hesitate I think it's very easy to say this story goes way back into the past and means something deep about the human condition. And I think there's a mythologizing and mysticizing of fairy tales, which I don't necessarily subscribe to as much as some people do, although I love them and use them so much. But I do think the urge to mythologize and use fairy tales that way is very much a part of the human condition. So I think it's a little bit of, there are particular stories I find very resonant, and many of them are quite established and old. I love Little Red Riding Hood, I use it a lot. But also it's quite fun to examine how fairy tales are used that way, and then see how you can apply that by modeling, by taking bits of other stories and modeling onto them. I will get onto the rest of the question in a minute, but there's an exercise I did with a group of illustrators once where, and I forced the writers to do it as well, they complain, but it's good for them, which is basically to pick two stories that have mythic weight to you. And it could be something like Little Red Riding Hood. You can't say death, you can say Hades and Persephone. It has to have a narrative. You can't say dinosaurs, but you can say Jurassic Park. It can be recent. But stories that feel really like mythically resonant, and to pick two, for example, the first example I did of it was Cinderella and Die Hard. And then to go, okay, your job as an illustrator is now to do a classic, middle of the road, 18th century set fairy tale picture book of Cinderella. But you need to liven up the pictures by taking bits of Die Hard and putting it, and by taking aspects of Die Hard and putting it in, and actually going, okay, the scene where he's like the top down view where he's climbing into the elevator, when could you use that? Maybe when she's running down the steps, have the top down view. The narrative images of drivers whose first day on the job it is in both stories. Why don't you have more pictures of Cinderella illustrated from the driver's point of view? Just these, the more you do this, the more you can say any two stories are the same story. Someone from a different socioeconomic background arrives late to a party at which they're not really welcomed. There's glass and bare feet. There's drivers whose first day on the job it is. You're like, oh my goodness, John McClane is Cinderella. But it's a fabulous exercise, or to do it with fairy tales. You can illustrate Cinderella in classic tones, or you could go, what if I take all the colors that I'm going to use in these Cinderella illustrations and textures from Little Red Riding Hood, and suddenly she's dressed in red velvet and furs, and just the shift that puts on. Or I'm going to take that from Jurassic Park.
And then you're really playing with connotation as well, and the resonance of different symbols being taken out of their sort of natural habitat, and again put in a totally different context to give them a whole new layer of meaning.
Yes, and it may or may not end up having those elements of the mashup or even be recognizable, but it does break it open for you as the illustrator. And then with bringing the myths together with the landscape, I just love the power of that. I occasionally see it done that can be very effective, but where people decide to do an Australian retelling of a fairy tale and do a direct one-to-one. Okay, Cinderella, going to have, instead of lizard coachman, it'll be you know, a bilby driver, and instead of horses there'll be kangaroos. All of this, it can work and it can be very funny, but I feel like it loses the power of both the setting and the fairy tale very easily. But I like the experiment of taking a fairy tale and essentially almost draping it over a landscape and letting it soak in, seeing what grows up, seeing what changes, seeing what goes wild. One of the reasons for loving writing in the Australian Gothic is that you can do that quite literally, and it doesn't have to be a good thing. It can be great to read, but clearly introduced species can be very problematic. But there's a lot of narrative possibility and leeway there, and it's lovely to see what changes. I had a story which started as a series of illustrations for an exhibition and ended up as a prose story with no illustrations at all for publication, which I'd been on an art retreat or art residency in Iceland. And I was doing that exercise of taking a fairy tale and going, okay, how would I illustrate? Again, I don't just do Cinderella, it's just the easiest to keep referring back to the same one.
Everyone knows Cinderella.
How would I illustrate it using just these visuals? Classic story, but suddenly you've got the sense of waterfalls and green moss, and make them very vertical, tiny people at the bottom, pale greens, pale whites, misty effects, the black basalt colors here and there. But then the more you let it soak into the story, the less it becomes about carriages and fairy godmothers, and the more it starts actually getting to grips with the history of a country which has never had a monarchy. What does that do to the story? What do you do with fairy godmothers in that more French English tradition sense, when you have a very different landscape and very different legends, and not necessarily setting it in Iceland, but just seeing what that thought experiment does to the illustrations, does to the story.
That's fascinating, because it almost seems to me that what fascinates you about fairy tales and myths, and that's the thing, is almost the atmosphere of them, not so much even the narrative content, but more the mood and the feeling and the sense of that kind of like when you juxtapose it on a sort of everyday setting, you create a sort of an undercurrent of mystery, don't you? And then this sort of sense of weird possibility. And I think that's a real feature in your writing too, is beautiful, and there's a lot of delight and a lot of whimsy, but it's also very unsettling, and there's this kind of underbelly of strange forces pushing and pulling, and and tangled things kind of hidden beneath the surface and emerging and complicating things. And
I love that. I love that description of it. Thank you. I love that description, and also that effect and that sense too, that just it brings its own sort of logic and laws with it. But just because they're hidden beneath the surface, they still make sense. And once you know you're caught in something, you know that that's not good news.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And terrible things can happen. But do you think that kind of contributes to your kind of narrative structure and the way your narratives unfold? Because you've got quite a sort of a convoluted, like Flyaway has quite a convoluted sort of plot structure, doesn't it? And how did that come about? That's kind of it. I mean, the plot structure to me almost seems to echo the vines and
Yes.
the invasive vines.
That was an interesting one, because it did begin as a much shorter story. And then I had a series of stories that were clearly set in a similar place, all of which involved taking usually more than one fairy tale element and doing that experiment with it. So I didn't want any of them or any of the story to be direct retellings, but there are bits that you can use. Like, there's one that's got a little bit of Little Red Riding Hood and a little bit of the Ballad of Tamlin. There's one that's a bit Pied Piper and a bit Sleeping Beauty, but neither, ultimately, I hope. Though I think the echoes are very visible there. So I had these stories that were growing, that were nearly fully story shaped, but just needed something more, and eventually realized that they're all set in the same place. I think they're connected, and then leaned them up against each other and threaded them through that central story.
And found that unifying factor.
But the visual element was always a very big part of it. And I think that there's a couple of them where I specifically had, there's one chapter in, which story is it? Well, there's one chapter in Flyaway where I wanted to key it to a particular visual note. And that was a line from Judith Wright, lean, clean, hungry country, full of old stories that go walking in my sleep. And I really like that. And I wanted to capture that element.
Speaking of things that lurk beneath, I was wondering, given this kind of, the fact that you have a bit of a magpie mind, and you're constantly gathering and observing and collecting and storing up things that you can use in unexpected ways. And from what you're saying there, like, you don't, I mean, it sounds like you kind of feel your way into things, and things gradually reveal themselves to you. And that was one of the questions that I had, is like, when you're creating, I was wondering about that interplay between your subconscious, your id, and your intellect. Like how much of your work is just feeling your way into it and allowing your subconscious to sort of play and associate these ideas, and how much actually comes from conscious, deliberate research or planning, and how the two play off each other.
Anyone who's had to edit my writing would probably say I feel too much at the page and need to be more specific. I seem to be able to get away with it a little bit more in the illustration phase. So a lot of it is just that there's something I'm trying to catch. I'm feeling my way to it. I'm writing my way into it, and then ideally, sometimes I never quite catch it, and then it's a process of editing back, tightening everything until it feels like it was organic. But sometimes you're writing, you're like, oh, I just caught a feeling, a note, a turn of phrase. With illustration, it's sometimes about finding a shape to hang everything on. I have a little, hang on, got my little sketchbook. When I'm first reading a book to illustrate it, I don't think you can see what this one is from the sketches. I'll just read it and I'll sketch through, just jotting down images from the book as I go, things that may or may not contribute to the illustration. Is that even in the camera view? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is. And it looks like they're just very, very iconic little sort of lines of energy and shapes and impressions. Like, you
so
know,
they're pretty much notes, notes to myself, things to use in an illustration, but also moments to put in. This one, I'm trying to bring elements together into one image. If it were to have pictures throughout a book, there'd be a lot more scenes as well. But just going through, just letting it flow through my hands, as it were, and then start drawing it together until I start to find images that click, but also a shape and a way to fill it. So I do quite like to have a stylized image. That picture I showed you from Flyaway, which fit very neatly in a square. That was the challenge I set myself from those. They all have to fit in a square. With Daryl Jones's memoir, Urban Ecologist, coming out from New South in September, called Curlews in Vulture Street. That was a really interesting approach, because I was doing it with a cut paper silhouette, which is a very fairy tale style. Daryl and everyone involved knew me as a fairy tale illustrator, but we're doing this very contemporary scientific memoir about birds in mostly Brisbane. And all of us were wondering how those would come together. And a lot of it for me was finding a line to put through all the images, a shape to fit it in, and then this kind of Art Nouveau-ish swirl, which would tie the image together, which would satisfy me in two ways, both the fairy tale feeling, the decorative feeling, and also a challenge to make everything work around that, especially if there's any elements of a contemporary world, which are often a bit harder edged. And then satisfy everyone else that everything else I was doing around that was accurate to the story. And I'm really happy with how it all came together. It was a lovely challenge. But yeah, it's often in both the writing and illustrating, playing, all that work I do in the observation journal, those daily little exercises are, I suppose, training my ear. And then when I'm working through the sketches for a project, there'll be a moment where I'm like, oh, I heard the right note there. There's something that, okay, I can start pulling everything together around that and unify it.
And I imagine in that process a lot gets discarded, but nothing's wasted, because it might resurface in the next book or the next one.
It's been quite funny putting the blog posts up about the observation journal, but I'm still putting up some posts that I first did the sketches for in October in 2020. And something that's been lovely about doing it at that, it wasn't meant to get to that larger lag, but there were a lot of things to post about. Something really interesting about doing it with that longer lag is that I'm reviewing these posts and I can see all the other places they got into. Occasionally they're about a specific project, and maybe I came up with an idea that got into that project and made it the whole way through the project and then washed out in the final edit.
Wow.
And then appeared in something else. So now I can actually go, oh, this was just me being silly on the page, but it turned into these things. Or this, with me mixing and matching elements, turned into a Twitter bot, Gothic novel Twitter bot that I wrote over December and January last year. And so no, nothing is ever wasted, but a lot of it is just that finding the sound, finding the word. Again, for that image and word parallel, something that's quite fun to do is to take a sentence. I walked down the street to the cafe, which was at the end of a laneway, and then pick a whole lot of adjectives from a couple different books, from a 1930s murder mystery, from a fairy tale and so forth, from a Georgette Heyer novel, and go through and essentially do Mad Libs. I walked down a snazzy little street to a jaunty cafe, or I walked down, you know, a oily green street to an ominously lit cafe, and the change that you can do with that. But you can do the same with art styles and with borrowing bits of vocab. Am I having dripping walls? Am I having walls with little sparks of light on them?
You would love this book that we picked up in an op shop called Exercises in Style. Have you seen?
Yes, I have. Oh, who's that by?
Yeah, I can't remember, but it's the one scene, young man on the bus with a button and not giving up his seat, and then that particular scene is just written in I think it's something like 25 different sort of genres that they explore.
There's a visual equivalent of that, which is also called, I think, 99 Exercises in Style, and I'm going to get the name wrong, but it's very easy to find, where he takes a one-page comic, going down to get something out of the fridge in the middle of the night and forgetting what he went there for, and does it in 99 different comic styles.
Wow, I'm going to have to find that one as well. That's brilliant. Speaking of style, this might be a nice segue into talking about your illustration, because you've managed to sort of create quite a defined style for yourself, quite a unique look. And I think you mainly use you do cut paper silhouettes and scraper board.
Yes.
And then you have your pen and ink drawings, which are a lot more sort of your cut paper silhouettes are very kind of precise. There we are. I imagine that's quite a demanding particular way to create an image. Like I like it. Like you seem to like setting challenges and parameters that are going to stretch you and kind of get you out of your comfort zone and get you solving problems. And it seems like that style would really do that. Like it's pretty unforgiving. And then you've got your drawings, which are much more loose and conversational and expressive, and seem to do the two styles. I mean, the silhouettes are quite consciously ornamental, aren't they? And they're quite formal.
It can be. Here's one here. I still try and get a lot of some movement and sense of personality and possibility into them, but even the ones, I'm just flipping through here quickly, even the ones where I'm trying to get a sense of distance and time and so forth passing, they are necessarily somewhat stylized the way I do them.
And do you feel like the two styles reflect two different aspects of your personality, or would you use them for particular explain what place each of them has as far as you're concerned, and what you're trying to express.
Show another one of this one where it passes through several different phases of the story time in one illustration. This was for Juliette Marillier's Mother Thorn and Other Tales of Courage and Kindness, 2 editions. I think I really like the constraint of the way I do silhouettes is fairly form. It's fairly naive, but it's necessarily form. There is an edge. Once you cut something out, there is no dispute as to where the edge of this picture is.
And it's a bit like a sort of a theatre scene, isn't it? It's posed. It's kind of a moment that you've frozen in this kind of.
And there's all these lovely little choices you're making, trying to hold it all together, because I almost always, with one exception so far, cut them out as a single piece. So even this illustration on the cover, which is colored, was a single silhouette, which appears there in gold. And then, yes, it is fairly mannered, even ones where I have a lot of movement, and you're making all these great like really almost technical choices of, okay, I have to have this joined at 2 or 3 places. I want this swirl of smoke to look like it's suspended in the air. So where are the least obvious places to attach that to trees and so forth, so it all holds together as a single image. And I really like that, and trying to get a sense of lightness and movement even within that. It's also one where I'm really sketchy at the beginning, and then the physical work, it's very physical process of cutting it out. I keep trimming. I've never hurt myself except where once I replaced a knife blade on my cutting knife, and it looked so sharp and shiny. I went, there, stab this off the finger. It was very late at night.
That's another pro tip: never pat your craft knife comfortably.
But and then there's that precision which is relaxing in a way, and you're just making these choices, making the edges, and then it comes together as an object. Whereas with some of my pen and ink illustrations, they're so loose and chatty that it's just sort of feeling for, hinting at something on the page and trusting the reader to come along with the intention that I'm going there. And in that case, occasionally I'll have to draw something 3 or 4 times until it's loose enough. If the first time I draw a donkey, it's not a good donkey, and the next time it's slightly better donkey. I was working on a donkey for someone once. They kept justifiably sending me back to do it again. And then you start getting a donkey right. You've worked out what makes a donkey a donkey. And then you have to keep drawing the donkey and getting rid of lines until your brain and hand know enough of what a donkey looks like that you can just show a couple elements of it, and everyone else.
Refining it down to essence of donkey and capturing that sort of energy. I mean, it sounds like with both those styles, there's a process of trying to retain the initial energy into the final. You know, with your silhouette starting very sketchy and loose, but then retaining those sort of lines of movement and those energetic sort of connections between elements and things in the final, you know, precise cutout. And with the drawings, trying to keep that initial kind of character while doing the sort of more rendered.
And people have asked, like, couldn't you do the silhouettes digitally or so forth? I'm like, I could, but I like the finality and the little infelicities, the weird bits that go wrong. Like, I'll do a couple digital fixes occasionally, but mostly I keep all the little rough edges and the strange corners.
Yeah.
This one is Flight, which is written by Angela Slater, which just came out this year, but I illustrated, I think, in 2016. It had a prolonged, it needed to be midwifed by various people over a prolonged period of time. And that's, I think in these ones, they are pen and ink with digital color.
Right.
You can see some of those silhouette elements, the borders and the little ornaments, but I do not have to commit in these to a particular, I don't have to commit to a particular edge of anything, even with color. When you've got the color and the line doing slightly different things, neither of them is necessarily the true edge of the dress, but together I hope they give a bit of a sense of motion and a hint.
Movement and energy.
Something I read today, there's a person I follow on Twitter who does a lot with early silent film. Early silent film.
Oh, right.
Which had color, that early black and white silent film from the very beginning, from the very first exhibitions of it, there was colored film. People would hand stencil color onto it. And apparently one of the most popular things to have colored in these films, hand colored, was dancers and dancers' dresses, because the movement would conceal anything that was wrong with the edge of the color. And I actually really like that. Something I can't get away with so much in the silhouette, a little bit, but which I can in the line work. It's like, I'm more just suggesting roughly where this is a guide for the imagination. This is a guide for the viewer. It's something for you to flow your thoughts through in order to enter into the story, but it's not a rigid depiction.
Whereas I guess with the silhouettes, there's absolutely no debate about where the edge is.
Yes, exactly. And then I have to hope that there's enough movement in it that anything that looks a bit odd, it's like, oh no, it's just because there's jumping off a point.
And I guess that's where those happy accidents come in, because if you did finesse it too much and you did go back and edit it or create it digitally, you'd lose that sort of organic immediacy that you get with, you know, creating it by hand.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, really the only fixes I tend to make digital, I clean it up, I darken it. If anyone here is here for the technical details, darken, like up the contrast in Photoshop, and then I will run it through a vector program to give a really strong black and white image, but I do not lose any of the little tags and bumps and ridges along the edges. It's really just to make sure it prints clearly. Very occasionally I'll fix something up if there's like, if I've cut out a space between some leaves and forgot to push it out before I scanned it, I might do a little bit of that. But yes,
I think that's really valuable to know, particularly for people who might be starting out with illustration, because I think that's a mistake a lot of people make early on, is feeling like they have to polish everything too hard and work back into things too much, and end up losing that sort of energy.
I have something else here to show you, which is why I'm feeling away. I've been saying lately, if you draw something a lot, it's art. If you draw something a lot badly, then that's just your style. You just get it badly a lot. And so I carry a little sketchbook with me instead of a camera now. I deliberately de-skilled as a photographer, just sketching things that I see around the place. I was today sketching the greening group, working with the prep students in the garden at a primary school nearby, and just doing these really fun. I'm going to come really close to the camera. There's a lot of these on my blog.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And there are all these, had an added challenge, which was that there were a bunch of 5-year-olds trying to climb up my drawing arm to look at it while I was drawing. And one of them was going, "How do you color so perfectly?" And I was like, I want you to look really closely at this, because in no way am I coloring between the lines. But if you do things like fast and chattily, it becomes, people aren't looking at what's on the page, they're looking through it to what you saw. And more refined an illustration is, there are different degrees. There's illustration which is photoreal, there's illustration which is just so beautifully rendered, which I don't do, although I admire it and I try to write that way sometimes. And then there's all that middle ground, which still is, you're picking up someone's imagination and giving it just enough to play with, or you're picking up someone's thoughts and pouring them through a series of shapes and colors so that they can do something narrative with it themselves. I really, Charles Vess, whose art I also love, he talks about that need to leave open lines in places and unfinished edges, so that the viewer still has something to do with the picture and a way in.
Process and create their own,
And really, you might do, if you do stuff 10, 15, 20, 100, 1,000 times, you'll get better at it. But even if you don't get better at it, you'll have done it that way so many times that everyone will think you're right.
That's right. It'll definitely be your voice.
Bluff.
And speaking of picking up on elements and running with it and creating energy, you actually started off by illustrating your own writing, didn't you? And you've recently moved into illustrating other people's, am I correct?
Other way around, actually.
Other way around. Oh.
Yes. So I've always written, I've always drawn. I was publishing a few short stories here and there, and I was working as a lawyer. Excuse me. I was working as a lawyer. I was a young lawyer living in a wooden share house with 5 other people, getting home at 1 a.m, trying to do all these things, all my fascinations. And at some point realized I couldn't, there was no way I could pursue all my interests at once. I made myself pick the ones I could do, would do, and wanted to do every day. So, for example,
sorry to interrupt, but you did that quite consciously,
consciously.
You set yourself.
Yeah. It was all getting out of hand, and I was distressed that I wasn't doing all the things I wanted. Okay. I lived in a wooden share house with 5 other people, and I often got home at 1 a.m. With the best will in the world, I could not practice the bagpipes every day. So I had to stop learning the bagpipes.
But your neighbors would hate you.
Yes. But I could write at least 100 words. That I can do that at 1 a.m. It takes like 3 minutes. Write fast doesn't make sense. And I could draw at least a smiley face. It's sort of like doing scales. Also, you get really sick of drawing smiley faces after a while. And then I would do a weekly illustration challenge, Illustration Friday. I don't know if it's still around. It'd just be a 1-word prompt, and then you'd share it on the
phone. I remember Illustration Friday.
And I'd put it on my blog every week, even if it was bad. Didn't matter if it was bad. Everyone knew it was for Illustration Friday. It was the challenge that was the point. And I was doing enough of those, and eventually someone contacted me, publishers in the States, Small Beer Press, and they're like, "Someone sent us a link to your blog, and we were wondering if you were available to do a book cover." And that was how I got my first job. I also missed my seat when I sat back down after reading the email. And I still work with them. I still work with Small Beer Press, and so much of everything else I've done has been through my contacts with them and with the people who we're pretty sure who it was at a party in the States who gave them the link to my blog. And yeah, that sort of just became its own thing. I started doing it more and more, and that's the reason I was always writing, but I was taking more time on that, stepping back from private practice to government, law going to fewer days a week and still complaining about not having time to do everything I wanted. And finally, Kim Wilkins, who became my MPhil and now PhD advisor, said, please stop complaining about this and applied to do a research degree, which I did in writing, because I had been writing, I had work to show, and that became Flyaway, but it was on the visual evocation of the sublime in Australian Gothic literature. So it was pulling the art in. And so I might have done one or two stories which had a couple images, but there were always two quite different tracks. It's more lately that I've started doing projects that are illustrated myself. So I do have a Patreon, mostly to fund the calendar illustrations that I put up for free on my blog every month. But for a few people, I do these really short stories every month. And a lot of them are very heavily image word. The balance is like very heavily skewed towards images. I am eventually hoping to do something public with those, but for the moment, it's the experiment, the laboratory. But yeah, really only lately started doing more illustrated projects.
Peek of behind the scenes of, what's brewing there. They need to come and subscribe to your Patreon.
Yes. And there's sneak peeks, and I do little things of printable stationery and so forth. I want people to be able to see things. The whole reason I did the Patreon was to have some support to cover the time I put in for the calendar, which is available for free for anyone who wants to print it every month and color it in themselves, or I've got a pre-colored version. But yeah,
Patreon is wonderful for artists. Like, I think it's a lovely model, and I think you're the opposite of a cautionary tale. I can't think of what the term is at the moment, but I mean, an inspiration.
A terrible example.
Yeah, but like making, like realizing what was important to you, and realizing, where your passion lay, and making a conscious decision that you were going to make, whatever steps you could towards it, and then putting it out there, and then everything sort of snowballing from there, and now you sort of created this wonderful kind of career trajectory for yourself that isn't property law.
It isn't, although bits of property law, there's definitely law jokes that have got into some of my illustrations. But it was interesting you said that, because many people, PhD advisor included, tend to say you have to learn to say no to things, embrace the power of no. And I have always felt, and I still feel this, you have to say yes to everything before you work out what to say no to. And I feel, for me particularly, and for people like me, sometimes you have to overcommit in order to know that the stove is hot. Like, people say, don't touch the stove, it's hot. I'm like, I believe you, but I don't understand what that means until I touch the stove. Like, oh, it's hot. Everyone's like, well, now I understand.
I think it's also especially important in a creative career where there's not a roadmap. There's no one right way to go about it. There's not a career path that fits everybody, and everybody sort of feels their way into it from strange angles, and everything everything is in there somewhere. So this might be a little gruesome, I'm sorry. No, I love gruesome.
But they're like, lived on the farm, we did a lot of work with animals and so forth. So you get your hands dirty in many visceral ways. And writing a short story recently, in which I was dealing with people getting transformed by getting stitched into the skin of a stag and roaming around. And the visceral elements of that were very easy to describe, because I may not have done that sort of farm work since I was 15, but I know enough. I remember the textures, I remember the feeling. And my mother read it and she's like, yep, I can tell you.
It smells like 1990 or whatever.
And there's so many things that you pick up which seem like they won't be relevant. I love reading early aviation memoirs. And I do not write scientific things. The appeal of early aviation memoirs is that I do not have to retain any details, and I can usually find someone to tell me more about it at parties, which is also quite useful. But there's elements of that, there's little bits of knowledge. There's a line very much, I think the first page of Flyaway, about the power lines or railways being used by pilots to navigate. And that comes from accounts of early aviation in Australia, where they'd follow the telegraph line. So if the plane went down, you could climb up the telegraph pole, cut the line, and the telegraph repair crew would come out and find you. And there's those little elements and bits of stories that come
Yeah.
into it.
So again, it's that sort of magpie mind of yours where
Yes.
you're continually collecting and absorbing and processing.
And also, and honestly, not being flippant, anyone who's unsure how to conduct themselves at publishing parties or other things like that, reading obscure, old, not recent, it needs to be old, non-fiction, best way to have topics of conversation with everybody. And if you find someone who is an expert in the thing you've read, a 1990s book on mapping risk of various sorts in America, you're like, oh wow, so you do like risk management, that's fascinating. I read this book from over 20 years ago. Clearly everything's changed. Please tell me more about it. Or you can ask some questions. Everyone thinks you're a great conversationalist and incredibly well read. In fact, you're just really weirdly read.
Yeah, the weirdly.
And can ask questions. But and now I'm corresponding with cartographers in the States about illustrated maps.
And you're actually working on a whole lot of maps at the moment.
Yes, and I do maps. So I'm not a cartographer. My maps are very geographically unsound. They're illustrated maps. They're about a way into the story, and it's about the place where this story is going to happen. And it's so wonderful actually talking to professors of cartography and knowing I don't have to defend myself. They can see what I'm doing. They know it's not scientific, and we can get excited about other aspects of the map. Find out that he's friends with the guy who wrote the book on the cartographies of fear, fan about that. But yeah, just all these fascinating connections and bits and pieces come together and really, and it's so useful for creative people as well as for parties.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's a kind of a lovely surprise to you as well, when the way that things play out and take their final form, and what emerges at the end of all of this assimilation and kind of
surprising what becomes tax deductible.
Yeah, exactly. And so when you're mid-flow, like when you're writing or creating, if you could actually step inside your mind, if your mind was a physical place that you could journey to, like a space that you could stand inside and look around, what sort of space would it be?
When I'm in the middle of working on a project.
Yeah, when you're in the flow, in the zone.
It does depend a little bit. If I'm at the stage of making things up, then I'm really watching what comes out the end of my pen. They say, head empty, only vibes.
Right.
It's very funny.
Externalizing.
Yeah. I found that more and more, the longer I do this, the more I let go of having an image in my head that I'm trying to draw. Occasionally an image in my head that I'm trying to accurately describe. But even with words and with pictures, I'm just letting I'm watching what comes out at the end of the pen. You're scribbling, you're drawing, you're like, oh, that's a nice line. That's okay. This is the sort of, okay, that's the way the hair should flow. Okay. Oh, now I've just been doing a whole series of little hind girls with antlers running around with leaves in their hair. I'm like, oh, okay, this is the line of joy for them. But it's not me going, what would be a line of joy? There's a little bit of back of the head consciously going, remember to put movement, tilt them forward a bit so they're a bit off balance. If I want this to be like family friendly, okay, I need to have them posed in such a way that the hair and the leaves flow naturally, like drawing mermaids. Like, how much am I showing here? There's a couple of those technical questions going, but especially the early sketching stages, the thinking is actually happening where the ink leaves the pen. And a lot of writing, I've been writing something recently which I really planned out. That was hard work for me. Usually I will write scraps and go, oh, that was an interesting person. Oh, I like that phrase. Okay, follow that. And then you write a scene and you're like, oh, okay, I wonder what sort of disaster that person would end up in. Write a disaster scene. I wonder what a fun ending note would be. Do I want it to end on a note of hope or a note of like incipient danger just over horizon, or a note of let's do that again? And then I'll try a little end scene. You start, in that case, it feels more like hearing, but essentially you're watching what comes out on the page and going, oh, there you are. But once I get to editing with the writing, when I'm actually trying to fix things, then I'm grumbling and complaining. And the more distance I get, then I'm able to go, okay, you have used 3 adjectives in a row. Can you just use one? There's a line, something I'm editing for the 5th or 6th time. And I just saw there's a line where a bat dropped from a tree with a leathery flapping of wings. And there was another adjective in there. I'm like, I could say that in like 3 or 4 words. Like a bat dropped from a tree with a leathery clap or something. There's a lot of other words in there which I don't need. So that conscious paring back. With illustration, once I've got the sketches done and I'm inking with the guide sketches underneath and the light box as a guide, or I'm cutting out the silhouette, or I'm coloring things in, I really sort of start splitting my attention a bit. So I am focusing on the line, on getting it right, on the pen, on the quality of the line, but I'm not thinking really hard about it. And the part of my brain that would go off and do other things, I do tend to occupy with music. If I'm on the computer doing coloring, I can't do anything narrative then. And with podcasts, I can't do story, I can't do books, or very rarely do books. I only do rereading books on audio when I'm doing art, but podcasts I'll have in the background. So
each stage of the process has its own particular vibe.
Yeah. And they tend to be podcasts which are fairly, they have a narrative through line for each episode. So I don't love a lot of true crime podcasts. There are 1 or 2 that are chattier and have a particular shape. But Air Crash Investigations, This Week in Virology, This Podcast Will Kill You, which is also about viruses, Disaster Girls. Actually, if anyone loves terrible B, C, D grade disaster movies, Disaster Girls podcast, where they go through and recap and recast and talk about what Towering Inferno is really about, is great.
Once you've got the sort of the problem solving done, and you're just onto the mechanical sort of rendering,
yes,
you can have other people's voices in your head and other narratives playing out and things.
And it needs to be, like I said, something with a pattern that I kind of recognize, so I don't have to be paying attention to it.
So it can just be in the background percolating away.
And it just I think it keeps the magpie part of my mind occupied.
Yeah. Need that sort of split level attention.
Yes.
Something coming in while something's going out.
Daycare for the busy part of my brain.
And so, as on a final note, it's been absolutely delightful, but on a final note, what are you working on at the moment while you're listening to your podcast? What's the next cab off the rank? Have you got anything in process that you can tell us about, or is it all you tell us but you have to tell us? Or
there's one I can't tell you about yet, but a series of silhouette illustrations for an adult fantasy novel, which I'm excited about. So if anyone's following me online, I will eventually be able to tell you what that is.
Do you have a time frame for when you're going to be able to do a big reveal? Or?
Alas, not yet for that one. But Daryl Jones's memoir, Colliers on Vulture Street, about urban ecology and a life tracking what native wildlife is actually getting up to in the suburbs, which was fabulous, and also good research for some other projects I was doing. That comes out in September. Are you
on that still, or is that in the process of being?
So I've finished that one and I've handed it in. As far as what I'm actually drawing, I am just at the point I'm about to go traveling for a couple of weeks, which I going to England. I'm looking forward to it, and I will be working and drawing while I'm there. So I've been trying to get a few projects up to a particular point. I've just been inking the July calendar today, and like I say, there are 2 I have to do. I need to do some sketches for a silhouette book cover in a series. It's actually for the Hebrew translation of a Frances Harding YA novel.
Wow.
And so I sort of know the shapes I need on it to fit with the other covers that I've done for that publisher. And I also have some sketches to do for a hardback edition of Angela Slater, who wrote Flight, her newest novel, which is just getting released this month, called The Path of Thorns. So I didn't do the cover for that, although it is silhouette, but I'm doing a few ornaments for a hardback edition of that. And there's something else I have on my to-do list. Oh yes, another map for another map for a middle grade fantasy novel in a series by Amanda Foodie.
Nice. Well, that sounds like enough creative procrastination to keep you busy for a long time.
I'm also editing a novel. It was meant to be a novella. It's definitely a novel. Will it become a novella? No one is holding out much hope. But I do have definite edits to do on that while I'm traveling.
Brilliant. So we'll look forward to all of that coming out. And in the meantime, while we're waiting, everyone should go and check out your fantastic blog to get inspiration, and also definitely just subscribe to your Patreon, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, I would definitely encourage that, but I am also a big fan of not paywalling too many things. So all the observation journal stuff is going up on the blog gradually, and occasionally I get to do workshops and things about that as well. So hoping to do a chapbook or book about that at some point in the future, but still.
Yeah, that would be really, really valuable, I think. And in the meantime, I'm going to go and explore your blog some more, I think. And I think that might be my weekend, doing some of your observation journal exercises. So thank you very much. It's been an absolute delight.
It's been lovely. There were such good questions, and I really want to talk more to you just about technique and style and art.
Well, we should have a cup of tea over Zoom one day.
Yes, sounds lovely.
It's a date.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Bye, Kathleen. Thanks so much.
Thank you.